Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of The Exercise Mechanic. Today we are doing our very first lit review. Now, what are lit reviews? Lit reviews are where we're going to be highlighting studies that we've stumbled upon, in particular over the last few weeks, that we believe are going to be relevant to our audience. Now, we know that sometimes reading literature can be a little bit daunting. So the aim of this is to provide a summary as well as a discussion and to make it palatable and digestible for personal trainers. Today's lit review is going to be focused on shoulders. Now, this is I wouldn't say one of my favorite studies, but it's a study that definitely piqued my interest as of late for a few reasons. Number one, as a personal trainer, throughout the cadaver labs that I've had an opportunity to do, I've noticed some discrepancies between what I've been told about how the shoulder works and perhaps why we hurt, and also what has been observable when we look at the mechanics. In particular, when it comes to, I would say, one of the most common shoulder injuries, which is that of subacromial impingement, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So today's study, the one that we're going to be highlighting today, is thanks to the individuals at the University of Leeds, Sheffield, and York. This study is called The Central Nervous System, and an additional consideration in rotator cuff tendinopathy, and a potential basis for understanding response to loaded therapeutic exercise. So the way that this is going to work is I'm going to highlight some sections of the study because it's quite long. It's about 18 pages. I'm going to highlight some sections of the study that I will read to you verbatim. Then we'll have a little bit of a conversation about it. In their intro, this is how the paper starts. It says, tendinopathy is a term commonly used to describe tendon pathology and or pain. Despite being a recognized clinical presentation, a definitive understanding of the pathoetiology of rotator cuff tendinopathy remains elusive. Say that 5 times fast. In addition to that, over recent years, there's been a focus on understanding pain associated with tendinopathy from the perspective of local tissue-based pathology. However, but in light of well-recognized association between pathology and pain, it's becoming increasingly clear that additional exploratory models are now needed. So what I want to highlight here is they're saying, in light of a well-recognized dissociation between tissue pathology and pain, we need to look at a holistic model, is what they're saying. And the reason why they're bringing this up is that this notion that there's a poor relationship between an orthopedic reality or tissue pathology and whether or not we hurt is becoming more accepted in many areas of the body, yet the area of the shoulder is a little bit slow to catch up. Tissue-based pathology pain models have been proposed and adapted to the rotator cuff. However, as mentioned, these models are confounded by the lack of association between pathology and pain. Now they're going to cite a study to provide a little bit of context. In one study, using magnetic resonance imaging, Frost et al. Could not distinguish individuals that were diagnosed with subacromial impingement from age-matched asymptomatic controls based off of what we understand about structural pathology. So what they did is they did scans of people that were diagnosed with subacromial impingement syndrome or stuff, and people of the same age. And so they age matched them and they scanned both, and they couldn't find any differences when it comes to the distance between the head of the humerus and the acromion. And so what I have here, for those that aren't familiar with what subacromial impingement is I've got a scapula and I've got a humerus. Now, what subacromial impingement is they're making reference to subacromial. So the acromion is this bone here on the shoulder blade. It's this bone here. A subacromial impingement is when the head of the humerus smashes up against this or approximates it, and it squishes the stuff that goes through this tunnel here. Okay, so that's what they're calling, or that's what has been typically made reference to as subacromial impingement. And that impingement syndrome has been a very common diagnosis and a describer for why people hurt. However, in one of many studies, they've shown that there doesn't seem to be, it seems like we can't infer causation when we look at the distance between the acromion and the head of the humerus, because some people who hurt have the same distance as people that don't hurt. So we can't really infer causation when we look at it mechanically. So I'm going to fast forward here to another section of the study that I thought was particularly interesting. They say here that the notion that the state of the tissue does not provide an adequate measure of pain is recognized in relation to other pain syndromes, but in tendinopathy and local tissue and biochemical based models are predominantly used to explain pain. So what they're saying is that the notion that the state of the tissue is insufficient to explain the pain experience is widely accepted. However, when it comes to tendinopathy, local tissue and biochemical descriptors are what are more commonly used. So there's a discrepancy. There's a preference to use structural models when explaining the shoulder in contrast to other areas of the body. They highlight here that it's particularly interesting because in some studies, they've shown that the rotator cuff does not actually always heal from a structural perspective, even though symptoms might improve over time. So they found that in a few studies that are cited here, that individuals will still present pathological symptoms at the shoulder when we do imaging, yet they feel better. So there's a lot of discrepancies that shed light on perhaps why we need to embrace what seems to be the truth, that the biomedical model, which is essentially stating that if you hurt, it's because something is broken, that is just incomplete. It's not that it's wrong, it's just that there's more to it. And so what this study is in particular highlighting and offering is that we need to take into account the role of the nervous system, including but not limited to our thoughts and our beliefs about what pain is and what we believe to be true about our injury and how that may adversely contribute to whether or not we hurt. So we're going to start talking a little bit about the nervous system here. They say, and I quote, "Central sensitization is a state that has been described in terms of altered processing where the dorsal horn cells in the spinal cord become increasingly sensitized. In this altered state, even non-noxious input, for instance, lifting your arm, can contribute to a painful output or painful experience. Recognizing that anomalies existed between peripheral tissue structure and the degree of pain experienced, proposed the presence of central sensitization in a significant portion of their patients who underwent subacromial decompression." And so even though they were decompressing the area, individuals would still hurt substantially. They would still present symptoms even though the mechanics were addressed. One of my favorite metaphors for this is that of a really, really annoying fire alarm. I'm sure many of you have cooked at home, like perhaps even just, you have toast in the toaster and then your fire alarm goes off. And it's like, dude, you're meant to detect a fire and you're reacting to toast. There's no problem here. And so that's an example of a receptor being highly sensitized to the point where it's somewhat maladaptive. It's like you're meant to detect threats. And it's like you're so sensitive that a normal amount of smoke associated with cooking toast is perceived as being as threatening as the house burning down. So the nervous system can respond in similar fashions. What we call hyperalgesia, allodynia, and central sensitization. It is now well recognized that this hyperreactive state of the dorsal horn cells can persist in the absence of an ongoing afferent input, which is what is known as pain memory. This reflects the plasticity or the adaptability of the central nervous system, which, if you think about it, that makes sense. If we've hurt an area, it would make sense to protect it, wouldn't it? So these adaptations are brilliant, and it's a good thing that they're there. In fact, individuals who are born without the capacity to sense pain tend to die early because they just can't detect very real threats to their biology. So pain's a good thing, and these adaptations are a good thing. However, they can become, I wouldn't say maladaptive, but they can hinder treatment when we don't understand them in the first place. If we think that pain equals damage, in contrast to pain equals the body's interpretation of perceived threat, those are two very different things. And if we're not careful of the words that we use, which is what we're going to be highlighting in a moment, if we're not cautious of the words that we're using and the inferences that are being made by our clients, that can actually adversely contribute to the degree to which they are hurting. We can actually negatively impact their recovery if we're not careful with the meaning that they're extracting from the work that we're doing and how they're feeling. So what they say here to kind of cap off that sentence is they say, so even in the presence of a recovered peripheral tissue, for example, a rotator cuff tendon, central sensitization can continue to contribute to an ongoing pain state where non-noxious input, meaning non-damaging inputs, contribute to a painful experience. Now we're going to get into some of my favorite sections here. Pain is an output in response to a threat. It's regarded as a protective mechanism which might be helpful in some acute situations where the primary aim is to minimize further threat, but unhelpful in other situations where unhelpful interpretation of a pain response serves as a barrier to recovery. We're going to unpack that a little bit later. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. The key feature that's proposed here in this study is that pain is a product of central nervous system processing at the level of the spinal cord and the brain, which is modulated by other factors, including thoughts and feelings, and does not necessarily reflect the state of peripheral tissues. Central nervous system modulation might be influenced by a range of intrinsic inputs, for example, beliefs about what the pain means, or extrinsic inputs, for example, societal context, or maybe what your trainer or your clinician are telling you. To highlight this, a person who has been advised to rest, believing that their shoulder pain is caused by tissues being compressed and catching or smashing together, depending on how catastrophic the delivery has been, is likely to present in a different way to someone who has been reassured and given guidelines about how to best get their arm moving. In this context, it's perhaps possible to see how the subacromial impingement model might adversely contribute to the pain experience and rightfully, and I want to highlight this, and rightfully is now regarded as an outdated and unhelpful way to understand shoulder pain, not just for personal trainers and clinicians, but to our clients. So to come back on this, they say that the central nervous system's perception of threat might be influenced by a range of contributing factors, such as our belief about what pain means, as well as other extrinsic inputs, such as societal context. Now, there's obviously a societal context to the rehabilitation process, and that context informs meaning. So as a trainer, if you're working with someone who is like, they maybe they recently experienced a shoulder thing, or in the past they experienced a shoulder thing, our response informs the meaning that they're extracting from that situation. Think of it as like when it comes to kids. It's been noted and mentioned many times over that when kids fall, they often look to their parents to inform whether or not they're actually hurt or not. And if an adult reacts in a manner where they're scared for their child's survival and their child's well-being, it's likely that the child will extract meaning that what they went through is dangerous, and that might then lead to the child or the infant crying and stuff like that. Now, obviously, the majority of us aren't working with babies, but that lesson holds true. Human beings are meaning-making machines, and the meaning that we extract and consequently associate to our experience informs our next experiences, and that can actually be either helpful or unhelpful to whether or not we are helping our client recover and feel better, or if we're actually contributing to the problem. So the thing that they mention here towards the end is that, to highlight this, a person who has been advised to rest, believing that their shoulder pain is caused by smashing tissues. And so for those that are just listening to the audio, I've got a scapula and a humerus that I'm kind of smashing together here. Could you see how, or imagine that someone visualizing bones smashing together and rubbing their tissues raw is a somewhat more catastrophic diagnosis in comparison to, absolutely, right now your shoulder is a little sensitized when you start to bring it overhead, but let's focus more on all the other things that you can do while we give that specific position a little bit of a break. But let's look at all the other things that you can do. One, I believe, and as they're offering in this study, one is a little bit more constructive to their recovery for a few reasons. Because as we know, there's also predictable downsides to not moving an area. There's very predictable downsides and consequences to inactivity. One of which has to do with the weaker you get, the more likely you are to actually, at a mechanical level, compromise tissue. So there's predictable value to encouraging people to move more often in different ways so as to promote the resiliency of the tissues in a vacuum. But as we know, there's also more that informs the pain experience than just the state of mechanical tissues. And cultivating hopeful narratives also helps with that stuff too. So cultivating hopeful narratives not only changes how we feel and interpret what we're going through, but it alters our behavior, which then also alters our mechanics. So there's predictable benefits to hopeful narratives, and there's also very predictable downsides to a catastrophic biomedical model, which is what they're offering here by saying that subacromial impingement, that diagnosis, might adversely contribute to the pain experience and rightfully is now regarded as an outdated and unhelpful way to understand shoulder pain. So an example, if we were to make this real for you, let's say you have a client coming in who's saying, I have subacromial impingement. As a trainer or as a clinician, you have already, there should be something in your mind that you're looking out for that you may need to address. You maybe, depends on the person, you may need to address what they believe is happening internally if there's evidence within the rehabilitative process that it's hindering their recovery. We'll zoom out to 30,000 feet and I'll give you an example, and then we'll make this a little bit more palatable, and we'll come back to the micro. If you are somebody who thinks that you are, in general, fragile, prone to injury, or even within a different context, if you believe that you're not confident, what's the likelihood that you're going to go do things that require confidence, like maybe going to talk to somebody? The truth of the matter is that the behavior in a vacuum is something that we all have the capacity to do. You know, like you use your legs, you stand at this point 6 feet from someone, and you make sounds with your mouth. That's all that's really required to have a conversation with somebody. But what would get in the way of an individual who has the narrative of I'm not confident, or I'm not attractive, or I'm not enough, or I'm worthless, narratives like that impact their behavior, right? And then consequently, it also impacts the feedback. Oh, pardon me. My alarm's going off. It also impacts the feedback that they're getting from the world, which will likely reinforce their belief of that narrative. So it ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy that through reps actually gets reinforced. Now, if we bring that back to the shoulder, the same thing can be true. If someone's saying, no, like I can't do that because I have a shoulder thing. I can't do this because I have a shoulder thing. That belief can impact their behavior, and then consequently their behavior can cause adaptations, either positive or negative, that can reinforce the belief that they're broken, and then consequently continue to contribute to this negative downward spiral of their function. So we really need to be cautious of the words that we use, and also we need to listen to the words that our clients use, as that gives us hints about their belief systems. And as we've already highlighted, belief systems do impact the perception of threat and whether or not we hurt. To further reinforce this, in this study, they say, and I quote, "If the pain is believed to be indicative of harm, such fear avoidance might result in further tissue deconditioning and a continuation of this cyclical relationship of tissue deconditioning, increased threat response, which then leads to you doing less, which then leads to you perceiving the world as more threatening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." But what they're saying is that depending on what someone believes their pain means, that can either reinforce them being very fear avoidant of certain things, or if there's a slightly more hopeful narrative, one that's less catastrophic, they may actually engage with behaviors that encourage tissue remodeling. As we know, Davis's law is the law that posits that soft tissues can remodel along lines of stress. As we know through Davis's law, tendon, ligament, fascia, muscle tissue, all soft tissue other than bone has the potential to remodel along lines of stress. So it actually, when it comes to tissue remodeling, other than perhaps a little bit of acute rest, it actually doesn't serve us to avoid areas that might have a current low tolerance, but rather it's beneficial to put a little bit of strategic load into those tissues. In conclusion, the cause of pain associated with rotator cuff tendinopathy ultimately remains uncertain, and there are clear limitations associated with current explanatory models that rely on a peripheral tissue-based understanding. So the understanding that we have been spoon-fed for a long time, which is rooted in the biomedical model, which is that you hurt because of shoulder smashies, right? Head of the humerus touching the undersection of the acromion, is just incomplete. And as they said, it might adversely contribute to the pain experience of our clients. So your homework as a personal trainer is to notice when your client or your clients come in with beliefs about their bodies that don't serve them, and then how can you challenge them, whether it be directly with words or perhaps creating contexts in the gym that are proof of a different narrative. In closing, 3 takeaways for you. Number 1, subacromial impingement as a diagnosis seems to be a very poor descriptor of why people hurt. Number 2, there's very little correlation between the amount of joint space between the acromion and the head of the humerus and individuals who are experiencing shoulder pain. And number 3, the diagnosis of subacromial impingement pain syndrome may adversely contribute to the pain experience, and we need to ultimately be cautious of the words that we use with our clients when describing to them what they feel. Keep in mind that human beings are meaning-making machines, so the words that you use matter.